Archives are about space and about time. There is always a hidden something that we have to look for very carefully.
A hidden concept, a hidden document, and a hidden narrative. How can we preserve an archive?
And how can we preserve documents in an archive? Archives are very important as a protest against forgetting.
If we want to anticipate the future, the lessons of history as a discipline are central to the art of archiving.
The future is sometimes invented with fragments from the past. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this conversation for the Foster Foundation. Greetings also from Norman and Elena.
Yeah.
When and how did you meet each other, Norman and you?
Oh, I can't remember exactly the date, but you know, it's at the beginning of his practice, more or less. I mean, I think, yes, I mean, soon after Willis Faber, I must have met him around the time that Willis Faber Dumas was made in Ipswich. Yeah, that's about the time. Well, was it the 70s, I guess? Early 70s even.
Talking about archive, you know, of course, the archive where this will be published is the Foster Foundation in Madrid, but we were very interested in, I was very curious about your own archive, because you have, of course, accumulated so much, not only knowledge and writing, but also books, conversations. How is your archive organized? Can you tell us about the plans for your archive?
Oh, well, that's very interesting, because I'm not, I mean, I'm nowhere near Norman's talent or his organizational ability, you know. I mean, what happened? I mean, my entire archive went to the Canadian Centre Canadien d'Architecture in Montreal, where it joined, you know, other distinguished archives, so to speak. I'm thinking in particular of Jim Sterling, Peter Eisenman. I don't know. I mean, there's a bunch of archives there. Well, part of Alvaro Ziza's archive is also in CCA in Montreal. But, you know, they organized the whole thing. I mean, I just, you know, basically my entire kind of all this enormous quantity of paper, et cetera, was just delivered to them, and they organized it. And in fact, that's an interesting thing, because recently, well, last year, no, wrong, 2020, time passes so rapidly when you're my age. There was a kind of so-called Festschrift on myself, organized by ex-students years ago. And in that Festschrift, at the very end of it, there's a piece by two Canadian architects, actually quite, rising, established by now, Canadian architects from Toronto, Shim Sutcliffe, who went to the archive, my archive, and dug out from the archive stuff by me, you know, including drawings, which I made. Actually, I can't draw like that anymore. I made pretty compelling drawings of the of Aalto's National Pensions Institute in Helsinki, as it happens, and details again. Because I was trained as an architect, of course, I fell into this academic business, or I allowed myself to fall into this rather peculiar game. And so I can't tell you much more about my archive, unfortunately, except, of course, it's obviously not of Norman's incredible extent. And you know, one last thing about Norman is that I went to an exhibition in the Yale, New Haven, Yale School of Architecture, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago. Well, with COVID, it's hard, maybe it's more, maybe it's 5 years ago, and which there were Norman student projects, you know, when Paul Rudolph was the dean of Yale, etc. He was there with, of course, Richard Rogers. But Norman's student projects were just, you know, outstanding. I mean, just amazing, very mature for someone who, you know, wasn't yet 30, you know. So, but I can't say any more about archives.
Yeah, I have one more question, so because in 2017, actually CCA, Phyllis Lambert's organization in Canada, organized and hosted an exhibition of yours entitled Educating Architects, 4 Causes by Kenneth Frampton. And that exhibition had also to do with your archive being there. And it sort of examined different dimensions of your seminar teaching. So it would be really great to hear a little bit about that and about archive and teaching and about this exhibition.
Yes, well, yeah, I mean, I was very privileged to have this exhibition, and well, of course, my books were on show, etc., etc. But maybe the most important thing, yes, this is a good moment to say this. I mean, you know, I think the most important book, which is actually probably the least well-known book of my life, is a book with the title Studies in Tectonic Culture, where Norman also appears, being towards the end of that book. And so, yes, I mean, this question of, in this pluralistic age, you know, in this, actually this age which has been anticipated by Guy Debord's Society of Spectacle, you know, the question of, you know, on what should architecture be grounded? You know, what is on what should, well, very simply, what should it be grounded in? And intuitively, I think it's a long story, but I mean, vis-a-vis the book, Studies in Tectonic Culture, I came up with this idea, which needs a lot of kind of qualification, of poetics of construction as being, you know, the kind of autonomous kind of rock bottom aspect of what is architecture. And I don't want to go into detail of that book, but coming back to the exhibition and to teaching, not only is Studies in Tectonic Culture maybe the most important book, not so well known, that I have ever produced, but for me, I mean, from my point of view, but also I used it, of course, in giving the book as a course on this question of tectonics, which of course is a problematic term because it needs also defining in itself. But because there's the famous geological version of the term, but then there's the question of, you know, tectonic, actually tectonic being related to the word architect and also to the Greek term for carpenter, tecton, you know, that's where, and therefore one comes back to wood and to carpentry as being a kind of one of the profound origins, so to speak, of building culture altogether. But in any case, in that exhibition in Montreal, there were models. I had, yeah, this is a story. It was very effective and was not respected, I must say, by the dean of the school. Yeah, that really irritates me because what happened? I got students to make study models. Some of these study models were of Norman's building. Actually, it was a very beautiful one of the Renault works in what is showroom repair plant in Swindon in England. And beautiful model made by students and not made by one student, but, you know, teams of 2, 3, 4 students, depending on the complexity of the work. And the deal was the following. I didn't want the model rushed. So I made a deal with, you know, totally corrupt. I made a deal with the students that they would get an A grade no matter what. If they did this exercise, they didn't have to write a paper. They had to produce a didactic model. They had to make drawings so that the model would be didactic of what was the building essentially about, you know. And so there were some of these didactic models in that exhibition in Montreal. That was the most gratifying thing for me because I think it was a real contribution. Because why? Because, you know, there's a tendency for schools of architecture to become ultra academic or just somehow or other, you know, highly sophisticated art schools, which is what has happened of recent date, where what is being done in the studios is not really part, in my opinion, of architectural culture at its best. So the aim of this book and the aim of the course I created out of the book was to, was sort of learning through doing idea. That is, rather than write a paper and all that academic bullshit, the students working together on making drawings for a model, and making the model would learn, internalize much more than reading books or whatever, I was absolutely convinced of that, and the students really enjoyed it. Of course, I guaranteed the grade, that's the other point. I didn't want the model rushed to finish a deadline. I said, if you show me a sort of 2/3 completed model at the end of the semester, I'll give you this grade and you will finish it, gentleman's agreement, some point, So they had time to do a good job, And sometimes, of course, I lost out. In the end, the gentleman's agreement, I lost it, they didn't. So what, I mean, from an educational point of view, I think it was still valid, it was against, against tradition and rules, so to speak, academic ones. But I think that in terms of training architects, I'm very proud of that.
Well, thank you so much. That's such a great answer. And of course, that had a lot to do with your teaching at Columbia, but there is also your teaching at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. And that's, of course, another really seminal moment in architecture teaching. And I think I'm always interested in what can we learn from, because they're very rare moments when teaching events, kind of new rules of the game. And I was very curious if you can talk a little bit about that experience, about the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies time, and also just in general, because now we're in 2022, and that's maybe the second part of the question. What would be your advice to a young architect in 2022? Because obviously Rainer Maria Rilke wrote this wonderful little book, which is an advice to a young poet. So I was wondering, what would be your advice to a young architect?
Yes. Well, okay.
It's two questions in one, yeah.
I know. I think I can sort it out. Well, the first thing is that I want to say about the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, which is 72 to 78, or I forget exactly the dates. But yeah, I mean, well, that's just, that it existed at 8 West 40th Street on top of a building. Oh, that's a very fascinating fact, that in this kind of double height space on the top of what would now be a rather low high-rise brick-faced, kind of building, office building. In this space, in this double height space, which was unique, we found out after a few years that Le Corbusier had been in that space editing pages of When the Cathedrals Were White, because the publisher had that space at some point. So there's kind of mythic, nothing thing, maybe not even true. But in any case, to come back to that extraordinary moment, it was a very, unrepeatable moment in Manhattan, in fact, maybe in the States altogether. And it was, in my opinion, it would not have existed except for Peter Eisenman, in fact. And Peter Eisenman, with whom I kind of disagree almost about everything, anyway, of more recent date, was unbelievable in terms of his charismatic leadership of that institution, and what we were able to make with very few people, in association with MIT Press, et cetera, in terms of exhibitions and exhibition catalogs and books and the magazine oppositions, et cetera, all of that was it was incredible how we, with this young energy and youngish, and and in a moment when the United States was not, it was still, I mean, the Roosevelt, that's an amazing thing. I mean, the Roosevelt New Deal really goes from, 1933 until 1980, actually, I mean, certainly the early 70s, there's still traces of that in American society, where the maldistribution of wealth has not happened. I mean, today, this maldistribution of wealth is paralyzing the United States, in my opinion. I mean, it's just so extreme, much more extreme than in the 19th century, much more extreme. And the consequences is a kind of paralysis, total paralysis. I mean, very dark story. And so, but I'm digressing. I mean, the Institute would not be possible today. I mean, absolutely not possible, partly because of the relative security of the society, because the New Deal was still kind of sitting there. It doesn't go until Ronald Reagan is finally elected president, and the whole neoliberal thing starts, et cetera, So, and the teaching there, I mean, yeah, I mean, well, it was kind of, there were architectural majors and young guys in liberal arts colleges coming to Manhattan and, listening to sort of lectures at the Institute and so on. But the more interesting thing about the Institute at that moment was it gave, not only did it produce all these books and catalogs and exhibitions and so on, but it also gave a lecture series, on all sorts of topics. So it was that was a space of public appearance for a brief while, up there on the top of this, I guess it was a 20-story building. And still there, in fact. But that, it's unthinkable that could be done now. And that Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies was sort of connected to the Museum of Modern Art. That is to say, it was connected to Arthur Drexler, who was then curator of the Architecture Department of the Museum of Modern Art. It was also connected to Philip Johnson. And these connections to the museum, Philip Johnson, etc., CBS, Frank Stanton, meant that, certain monies came into the Institute. That has also enabled it to function. And it also, because it did these extension programs for liberal arts colleges, it got money, and from this point of view, and also, state and federal grants to a limited extent, enabled it to function economically, but also would not be possible now. So it's not so much a teaching thing. And then if we come back to the other part of the question, since that was a rather long answer.
No, it's a great answer. And I actually had a follow-up question on that answer, because you say it wouldn't be possible today. I want to just try to understand what was the secret of it, because obviously it was, so Eisenman drove it, you were very, very, very important in that mix. There was Tafuri, as far as I understand, there was Kohlhaas.
Yeah, brief,
and what was the secret of the recipe? I mean, was there a certain degree of informality also about it? Or?
Oh yeah, very informal, very informal. And it attracted, people like the young Bernard Schumi and the young Rem Koolhaas. Rem was living in New York at that time. And also, then the five architects, Richard Meyer, Michael Graves, John Haydock, etc., were very sympathetic to that place. I mean, of course, Peter had also created the five architects. There would have been no five architects without Peter Eisenman. So Peter's creativity, in that sense, I mean, he was an impresario in a way. As he used to say, he used to describe himself as a souffle maker, I mean, he was really brilliant. And in many ways, although he's practiced as an architect and all that stuff, I mean, the great work of his life was that extraordinary place that without him would not have existed. Absolutely not. And this charisma, a very charismatic person. And so, well, he's still around, but I mean, we're all a bit ancient. What else? Yes, about this question of, yeah, maybe that we can go back to that topic. But the question of, advice to a young architect, and this is another irony. Actually, I became a father very late in life. I was 52 years old when our son was born. And this retardation, myself as retarded, that is, my God, what a burden it is for the next generation, because my son, who's very intelligent and much more, more mature than his father, but nonetheless had the difficulty, he graduated, he wanted to do video game design, etc., etc. He graduated from all of that with a master's in 2008. That was a bad moment because of the economic crash of 2008 and so on. In the end, he just couldn't find his place in the video game industry. So now he, what an irony. He's about to graduate from the School of Architecture, Columbia University, with a master's in architecture at the age of 39, sadly. It's quite late to enter this crazy game. But, that's what he ought to have done from the beginning, really. But of course, given, the Oedipal complex, et cetera, he sort of steered himself away from that, but probably that would be a good thing. So anyway, your question, what is your advice to a young architect today, is more and more kind of, some bordering on a painful question. I think, because we live in, such a difficult world, and, there are many different ways, obviously, of practicing architecture today. So either by choice or by luck or something, people have to find their way to find what is the way in which they would like to practice architecture. And so there are different ways. But one thing, given, given the triumph of neoliberalism and the weakness of welfare states, relatively speaking, I mean, they're still very strong in Scandinavia, etc. They're rather weak in England, I would say, having been weakened deliberately by right-wing governments, the health service I'm thinking of in particular, finding a vehicle for one's, I mean, fortunately in England, I think, housing as a public-private compromise has been revitalized, of late. And yes, maybe he could, with his wife, go back to England or something and work in a kind of office doing public-private housing. He worked this past summer for David Chipperfield in London, in fact, on Zoom even so, but that wasn't ideal, but online, I mean. But, I think, and I have this idea to write an essay with the title, The Presence of Architecture. I'm not quite sure what I would say, but, I think that this question of poetics of construction and of place creation, even whatever, small, big, whatever, these two things are fundamental. I think that the poetic of the technical invention and its program, humanistically speaking, and above all, its place, its formation of a place. I think this is very important, so that the proliferation of freestanding objects, in and of themselves, is a kind of nightmare. And Manhattan is really basically destroying itself because developers can do whatever they like. There's one pencil point high-rise building after another, totally at random heights, except they're all covered in curtain wall, of course. Actually, I think the people making glass and cardboard have probably made untold fortunes, because of the extent to which the answer is always the curtain wall, the extent to which under COVID, of course, more than ever, stuff is marketed in cardboard boxes. I mean, these two industries must be doing all right, I think. That's a bit of a digressive answer, but I'm sorry. That's the best I can do.
But it was a great interview. Thank you so much for your time.
No, it's very nice to be with you. You're a great interviewer. Thank you.